Hello, everybody, and welcome to this virtual discussion on rebuilding US democracy together. I am Henry Farrell, and I am the moderator, and we have two wonderful guests today, one of whom should be familiar to all of you, and the other of whom ought to be familiar to many of you. The first is Dean Eliot Cohen. Eliot is the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies. I'm not going to even begin to try to detail all of the things he has done. Suffice to say that he is a very distinguished scholar of international security and military affairs, who has also served in a variety of roles in different Republican administrations. And he is going to be talking today to Hahrie. And Hahrie is the inaugural director of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute, which is devoted to the study of democracy. Hahrie is also a scholar who works on civic organizing. She is interested in social movements. She has done a lot of work on grassroots activism, and she too has been involved in politics. She was involved in the transition team for the Obama-Biden administration. And as I say, I'm the moderator. I'm a professor who is jointly affiliated between SAIS and the Agora Institute. And also, as you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from Ireland. And this has two consequences. First of all, being Irish, I don't know nearly enough about American politics, even after 2 decades here. There's still many aspects of it that I feel bemused and I'm puzzled at. But also being Irish, I have very, very strong opinions nonetheless. So, and I am a professor, as I say, who is jointly affiliated between the SNF Agora and SAIS. And in a sense, my position is a down payment on a deeper partnership that is being built between these two different parts of Johns Hopkins University. And this conversation, we hope, is going to be a down payment, another down payment upon that developing relationship. As should be clear, Eliot and Hahrie come from the question of how to rebuild American democracy from different starting points. They have different political backgrounds, different intellectual interests, and different senses of the world and different ways of thinking about how democracy works. Eliot is somebody who has been very directly involved in policymaking. Hahrie is somebody who has had policymaking experience, has had that, but is also directly interested in how it is that politics can be built from the ground up. So despite these different backgrounds, they also share goals, and they share a very fundamental commitment to making American democracy work. So what I hope we can do today is to explore with both of them what kinds of things all of us can come to agree on, and also what kinds of things we disagree on, because disagreement and the harnessing of disagreement is at the heart of democracy. If you think about what democracy is, it really is, as much as anything, an engine for turning political disagreement to productive and useful and beneficial and peaceful ends. So what I want to do over the next hour is I want to have 30 minutes, which is going to be devoted to a panel discussion. And then after that, there is going to be 25 minutes for questions and answers. And if you have any questions that you want to submit, you can submit at any time using Zoom's chat function. And I will try to keep an eye. And then when we get to the questions and answers period, I will try to speak to the questions. I will try to pose the questions so as to keep the conversation going. And many of you are Johns Hopkins students, and we are particularly interested in engaging with you. And it also is good and fun for us to know which parts of the university you are coming from. And after about 25 minutes or so of this, we're going to have 5 minutes at the end where the different people in the panel can sum up what they think the discussion has done, what they think it has accomplished, and what are the things that need to be accomplished going forward. So what I'd like to do is, first of all, to turn to both of you. As I say, I'm somebody who's puzzled by key aspects of American democracy. And part of this is because I didn't grow up here, but also I think that all of us, I think, have been faced with questions that we didn't really anticipate and that we don't necessarily know the answers to. So as you both think about how to rebuild American democracy, what are the continuing puzzles? What are the things that you think we simply don't know enough about that we really need to get to a better understanding of? And perhaps I can start with Eliot.
Thanks. Well, first, Henry, thank you for agreeing to chair this panel. And I just want to say, Hahrie, Henry, it's just delightful to be here with both of you. And I take very seriously what you said, Henry, about this being a down payment on a much deeper partnership with SNF Agora. So I guess for me, I think the big unknown, which a lot of people have not so much not figured out as in some ways chosen to ignore, is why have so many Americans bought off on an essentially illiberal, in the proper sense of the term, approach to politics, as we've seen, both in the primarily, of course, in the rise of this particular administration, but somewhat more broadly as well. As I think you indicated, liberal democracy really rests on some very deep mutual agreements about the nature of civic discourse, about the nature of truth, about what it means to agree to disagree. And it is stunning to me how many Americans, from where I stand at least, seem not to buy into that. And I think until we wrestle with that in a thorough and in some respects non-judgmental way, it'll be difficult for us to make progress. But first, we just have to understand why.
Hahrie.
Yeah, so let me also start just by echoing what Eliot and Henry said, that we at SNF Agora are just delighted to have this opportunity to this is one of several ways in which I feel like we've already begun a partnership that I hope only continues to grow between SNF Agora and SAIS. And so I am really delighted to have the opportunity to have this conversation today with Eliot and with Henry. So to answer the question, maybe, one way I can start is just by saying, my experience of American democracy early on was colored by the fact that I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas. And so my grandparents were refugees during the North Korean War and migrated south from North Korea to South Korea. And then my parents eventually immigrated to the United States. And I think hearing the experiences of my grandparents in North Korea, one of the ideas that was always instilled in us is that democracy is great, but it's also very fragile. And I think that hearing the stories of what my grandparents had to go through during their refugee experience, and then my parents' decision to then move to the United States and raise us here, I think always gave us a sense that democracy is this thing that we have to protect. But when I was a kid, it wasn't necessarily discussed as a sort of conceptual idea, but it was more, a set of practices, I feel like, and this idea of us trying to figure out what it meant to grow up in the United States. And so why am I offering that background? I think that I agree with Eliot very much that one of the big challenges for us to grapple with as a society is this question of why is it that so many people have adopted what we would traditionally think of as these illiberal tendencies. But I guess I would come at it from the perspective of why is it that so many people have lost that muscle, right? That democracy is not just a set of abstract ideas, but instead it's a set of practices. It's a muscle that we have to develop, just like we all have to go to the gym to develop other muscles in our body. And why is it that we've starved so many of the kind of spaces where people develop those kinds of muscles? And so a lot of the work that I've done, and I think also that I hope that we can continue to do in SNF Agora, is to try to ask those questions of A, what are the characteristics of the kind of spaces that we need to create to enable people to develop the muscles they need to make democracy work? But then B, how do we make the proliferation of those kind of healthy spaces, if you will, more common and more likely, not only in the United States, but in other kinds of democracies all over the world?
So both of you you're both academics, but you're both academics who have a strong interest in practice as well. So thinking about this practically, so we don't know what's going to happen next week, obviously, but so if we are in a situation where we can start to really rebuild American democracy, and build the ability to start to develop those muscles, what kinds of practical steps should we be taking? And what kinds of ways can the academy, what kinds of ways can universities like Johns Hopkins help in that process of rebuilding? And either of you, as seems good.
Hahrie, you want to go first?
Sure. Okay, well, so I feel like there's a lot of questions here that are sort of interrelated. So first, in terms of like, what are practical steps that we can all do? So I think that often, I mean, I study grassroots politics, right? And so I'm someone who comes at this from the perspective of thinking about the sort of ways in which people, ordinary people engage in public life in a variety of different ways, and why that matters. And I think that often, sometimes the undue focus that gets put on presidential elections in the United States makes people think that the only way in which democracy is instantiated in their lives is through the election itself. And if I were to sort of say, well, what are the ways in which people can start to rebuild democracy? The first thing I would say is to sort of try to get involved in all the ways in which democracy is present in our lives. And that in some ways, so many of the problems that people seek to solve are things that are done at the subnational level, right? Fixing roads, like, schools in our communities, like all these different kind of things that sort of have a more day-to-day presence in people's lives are actually decided at subnational levels. And the sort of the experience that we have in our everyday lives in terms of interacting with each other often happens through civil society, not just through sort of governmental institutions. So I think there are ways in which people can all get involved. In terms of thinking about the role of the university in particular, I think there's a lot of things that people talk about in terms of universities play an important role in cultivating citizenship in the sort of small c sense of the word, in the sense that they help students learn kind of the knowledge they need to be democratic citizens. They help people develop a set of practices and habits of learning to debate and engage across difference and to use evidence to back up their arguments. But let me also offer a sort of different idea, which is that democracy, I think, depends in large part on losers accepting loss, right? And the idea that people who don't get their way have to be willing to respect the process itself, so that we can have these peaceful transitions. And I think that universities and other sort of elements of civil society have a more important role in developing that kind of tolerance for loss than we commonly understand. Partly it's just to sort of make us understand the sort of conceptual reasons why that might happen, but partly it's because those kind of spaces, both in academia and in civil society, help lower the stakes of loss itself. If people feel like there are alternate areas and a plurality of spaces through which they can exercise voice. So it might be that my candidate loses on Tuesday, but I have other areas in my life where I begin to feel like I can exercise voice over outcomes that I might care about. And I think in that sense, everything from the university to other parts of civil society play an important role.
So I guess first thing I would say is that from my point of view, if my diagnosis is correct, that there's a deficit of educated citizenship, a lot of the remedies actually belong in the educational world, although actually less in the university world than particularly in secondary education. With giving, you can't have a functioning liberal democracy without citizens, and with people who understand themselves as citizens, which means accepting losing, which means accepting certain rules, which means thinking about a common good. It's not, our Constitution's not a mechanical arrangement simply. It's not as though it can be, I think it was Kant who said that if you could have a system designed, if the system was well enough designed, it could be operated by devils and you'd get the outcome that you want. I don't believe that at all. I think you need citizens. So I think there's a large educational component to this. I am an institutionalist in many ways. And so I think there's simply a lot of institutional repair work that needs to be done. And although I very much take your point, Hahrie, about it's not just about presidential elections. There's still a large element that is about presidential elections. And in particular, I would say about the functioning of of the Electoral College. I was looking the other night at Lincoln's first inaugural, and if you don't mind, I'd like to just quote a couple of lines from it. This is towards the end of his first inaugural. He says that a majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. And then he goes on to say that the rule of a minority as a permanent arrangement is wholly inadmissible, so that rejecting the majority principle, anarchy or despotism in some form is all that is left. And I don't for a moment dismiss the significance of the fact that we've begun getting presidents in cases where a majority have voted for the other candidate. And I think that is, in the long term, inimical to free government. I mean, if you get to a point where there isn't some form of majority rule, again, bounded, as Lincoln said, by all those checks. The final institutional piece I would mention is, this is one that kind of cuts kind of close to home, is the Republican Party. Not in the Constitution, but important nonetheless. We have these two great political parties. And as somebody who left the Republican Party after the election of 2016 and has kind of watched in horror as people that I knew and respected have gone along with things that I don't think anybody should go along with, I really wonder about its future. And I have to say, this is, although in general, I am always a long-term optimist about the United States of America, this is one thing I'm pessimistic about. I mean, hopefully I'll be wrong, and the Republican Party can rebuild itself as a principled party that, will take conservative stands. We need a conservative party, the same way you want to have a liberal party. But I really have grave doubts about that. And so if that is true, then, you have to think about, well, what other kind of party structure would be appropriate? And if you can repair the Republican Party, that would be obviously a great thing too, but it's going to be difficult given the way it's branded itself. Then finally, with respect to universities, I think, yes, part of our job may be to help offer solutions. It's always, of course, to figure things out. If our motto is that the truth will make you free, then obviously we simply think figuring out the truth is important. But I also believe that at this juncture in our history, there's a particular responsibility that universities have to protect free discourse and to demonstrate free discourse. And let no one doubt that can be endangered from the left every bit as much, and indeed in some ways more, from the left as from the right. Universities are not quite political monocultures, but they're getting close to it. The survey data shows that. And it's therefore, I think, particularly important that universities stake out extremely forceful positions on freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, because we can't take those values for granted either.
I'd love to jump in here for just a second to respond. So first of all, I just want to agree with a lot of what Eliot said, which is that I completely agree that there's really important institutional reforms that we need to really grapple with, I think, as a society, as a democracy in the United States. And but I was part of a commission at the American Academy recently that put out a report called Our Common Purpose that was about rebuilding American democracy, essentially, and brought together, this commission brought together a lot of people from left and right and from academia to other parts of society. And one of the points that the report made that I think is really true is that democracy is really an interlocking system between, political institutions constrained by rule of law, mass political behavior, and then a set of culture and norms that make democracy work, and that we probably need reform in all three of those spaces. And so, I think that's right. I think sometimes I worry when I hear the conversation about reform of political institutions that it feels like there's this underlying assumption in a way that has this flavor of, if we build it, they will come. So if only we could reform the electoral college or gerrymandering or something like that, then all evil will be eradicated in our democratic system. And that's what I worry about, and that's why I feel like things, pockets of civil society then begin to really become important in making the other parts of that interlocking system work together. So.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But I think sometimes when you begin making the institutional fixes, you're also making the more subtle kind of psychological fixes as well. In other words, you're signaling to people, look, this really matters, and it matters that it be done fairly. So it actually the mental impact of the institutional changes can be, I think, as powerful as the changes themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a lot of these downstream consequences of the policy changes themselves that go outwards to affect people's political orientations and behaviors that I think are important ways to think about the institutional fixes themselves. I also just wanted to, Henry, if you don't mind, and then I will not hijack the conversation, but I just wanted to make sure to also pick up on what Eliot said about the important role that universities play in facilitating discourse and a free and open debate of ideas from all sides. And I think I would completely agree with that. And I think in a lot of ways, that's fundamental to the mission of the SNF Agora Institute. That part of why we were created in a way was because we wanted to stake a space within Johns Hopkins and hopefully within academia more broadly to articulate the importance of those kind of spaces. One thing that I would put out there, where I'm curious to hear what Eliot's response to it is that when I think about the importance of cultivating and protecting that space, I think about it as normalizing this idea of contestation and struggle, right, as being a part of how we all learn, how students and all of us learn to be democratic citizens, and that we need to normalize that. And that in order for that contestation and struggle to be enabled, we have to allow for views on all sides to be a part of the conversation. But then at the same time, I also feel like one of the phenomenon that we're seeing, and this probably is happening more on the left than on the right, is that there's a proliferation of new kinds of voices now that are being legitimated in public discourse that weren't necessarily present, certainly, let's say 3 or 4 decades ago, when you had more elite control of public discourse and things like that. And that is challenging, I think, the range of ideas that we begin to think of as acceptable. In some cases, some of the sort of more illiberal notions of cancel culture and shutting down opposing viewpoints are coming from, sort of new voices on the left, just as they're also coming from other voices on the right. And in my mind, part of the role of spaces like the Agora Institute is to sort of think about how do we create settings that allow for a broad range of viewpoints, but also take into account the power inequities that inevitably exist between these kinds of voices. And, I have a political colleague who talks about how shared power is an exchange of interests and resources. And so the basic idea is that I have to feel I'm willing to share power if I'm willing to use my resources to act on your interests, right? And you're willing to use your resources to act on my interests. And so in order to make that possible, both of us have to recognize each other's interests as valuable and recognize each other's resources as valuable. And so to me, in a lot of ways, the challenge when we think about sort of, when I come across, let's say, students that might want to shut down viewpoints on the other side, the challenge is to sort of help have a discussion about, are the interests of people who disagree with you valuable or not? And what are the resources that we all bring to making our system work or not, even if we disagree on particular policy points?
I think, the good news is we may finally be edging a little bit to little bit of disagreement, which because this has been there's been a boring degree of consensus
Yeah.
here. So, truth is, of course, I agree with what you've said. I would say a couple things. One is what's at the heart of a university has to be the use of reason
Mm-hmm.
and facts and evidence. And I think there should be no topic or viewpoint that is somehow connected to arguments from facts and reason that we should exclude, even if it's upsetting. And that leads me to a second point, which is I will tell you the truth. I've always been uncomfortable with the idea of safe spaces, because I believe that an education often feels intellectually unsafe. Obviously, we want people to be physically safe. Obviously, you can't have people being abused in any way or bullied or harassed. But that was the whole point of Socrates' life, wasn't it? That he was making Athens a little bit unsafe, and that's ultimately why they gave him the hemlock. And I think we have to teach our students that you may be going into conversations where you really don't like what you're hearing, and it makes you uncomfortable or uneasy, and that's maybe part of growth. The final thing I would say is, so I think there would be some people who would disagree with the argument that the elites had less control than they now than they did in the past. I think this in a way goes back to my initial observation. I think there's probably a whole tranche of people out there who will be voting for the president who feel that their voices are suppressed. I think part of the phenomenon that we're looking at is a cultural one. And I think people haven't, and it's clearly a complicated phenomenon. But I think there are a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum who feel their voices have somehow been suppressed. And what's bizarre about that, of course, is that we're now in a world where there's this incredible multiplicity of outlets. I mean, everything is out there. And if you want to start your own magazine effectively, you go to Substack, and next thing you know, you've got 15,000 followers for whatever it is you want to write. And yet, oddly enough, there we are.
So, Eliot, if I can, and this is to, as you say, disagreement is good here. So one question I would have is that it seems to me that you have, on the one hand, your diagnosis of where the conservative movement has gone wrong with the Republican Party more broadly, seems to, a lot of this has to do with the way that it takes extreme positions sometimes, precisely because there's some sort of, because this is to, quote, freak out the libs or whatever. And then on the other hand, you have this strong commitment to creating this university, which is about uncomfortable and awkward situations, possibly where difficult conversations can be had. So what kinds of practical ways can you prevent those kinds of spaces from being weaponized so that they aren't just about trying to create real and deep argument, but instead are being used specifically in the way that some conservative, the conservative movement, some parts of the conservative movement have turned to specifically in order to outrage and to offend.
So let me try to deal with the two parts of what you said. The first is you said the conservative movement. Actually, of course, there are multiple flavors of conservative out there. By the way, I don't even really particularly think of the current administration as being conservative. I mean, there's no, fiscal discipline. I don't think so. Respect for the Constitution. I don't really see that. Traditional mores, values, what have you? No, I don't see that much of that either. I think the truth is the conservative movement in the United States, such as it was, which has multiple strains. Some of them quite rancid. Some of them clearly, just purely racist and ethno-nationalist. Others are very sincerely libertarian. Others are, kind of where I would put myself in terms of having, kind of traditional sort of Burkean views of how societies function. So I think we got to be very careful. I don't think the Republican Party, by the way, right now is a conservative party. It is something else, and that's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that it can serve that valuable function. In terms of how do you do what you want to do, I think this is where our responsibility as teachers comes, and it's why I think we're at a time when the scholarly and research missions of universities are, of course, at the forefront. But let's not forget the educational functions, and I think it's both in what we model, but in the way that we police that space, because we are given the power to police that space at some level. When you're just very concretely, when you're in a seminar, if somebody's saying something uncomfortable, but interesting and possibly true, then you play it out. And if somebody gets offended, you say, well, but they made an argument based on the following evidence. What do you do with that? On the other hand, if somebody's simply being outrageous, then it's up to us to say, well, what are your grounds for saying that? And, to deflate it in one way or another. And it's one of the reasons why I think the teaching mission is just an incredibly important one for any society that wants to stay free.
So I think we are now moving to the point where we are getting questions and answers from the audience. And anybody who wants to ask a question, there is a questions and answers box. And we have got a question from Scott Shane, who asks, and this is going back to the question about structural reforms, whether or not you believe that it is possible and desirable to not only to eliminate the Electoral College, but to think about granting statehood to DC and Puerto Rico, and would like to know what your views are on that as a possible way towards rebuilding democracy.
Well, I'll take a swing at it. With regard to Puerto Rico, I think statehood has actually been on the table for quite a while. The people of Puerto Rico have to decide if they want to apply for it. I mean, there are benefits to their current arrangement. And, that's why I don't think you've seen anything remotely like a unanimous cry for statehood from Puerto Rico. But for sure, if Puerto Rico wants to become the 51st state, I would be in favor of it. There'd be no reason not to. I mean, it'd be a bigger state than, in terms of population, than some of our existing states. DC is more of a difficult question. And different countries have dealt with it differently. So, obviously, go back, to the UK. I mean, London is just part of Great Britain. Other countries like Australia have really maintained the idea of a separate federal jurisdiction, which has unique status. I think there is something to the argument that the current arrangement disenfranchises a significant population in terms of national politics. On the other hand, there are unquestionably peculiarities that are involved in being the host of the federal government. And I suspect that there's probably some sort of compromise. A chunk of DC was peeled off to go back to Virginia. One solution might be to make the other part of Maryland. But I have to say that's one I'm less certain about. I mean, I certainly understand the argument for disenfranchisement is a very powerful one. Whether it's a great idea to have it as a separate state, given that it hosts the federal government, I'm not entirely sure.
I'll chime in to say, for me, I feel like we definitely need reform of the Electoral College, right? That we've seen this repeated pattern where presidents are elected with a minority of the vote, and I think it leads to distorted political outcomes that probably aren't in the long run good. I've seen multiple different kind of versions of how we reform the Electoral College, from eradicating it completely and going to pure popular vote, to restructuring it in different ways that that accommodate different kind of political realities. And so I don't know that I have a strong view yet as to which of those modes of reform is most effective, but I do think it's a question that we need to grapple with. But as we grapple with it, I mean, I think this goes back to something that Eliot and I were talking about earlier in the conversation, is that it is going to be true that getting rid of the Electoral College probably will, I mean, almost every version of reform that I've seen does advantage urban, more populous areas over less populous areas. And the urban-rural divide is an important divide, I think, in our political landscape that we will have to grapple with. And so in the same way that democracy depends on tolerance towards losers, so to speak, I think that if the rural vote is disadvantaged, we have to think about other institutional mechanisms that would allow for those voices to continue to be an important part of our political system. And I think so those are the kind of like tensions that I think have to be balanced. And to me, like, oftentimes I see the sort of reform of Electoral College and DC and Puerto Rico statehood is put into one conversation together, which are all basically different ways of getting the Democrats to, make it easier for the Democrats to win both the Senate and the Electoral College. And I think that shouldn't be necessarily the motivation for making those kind of institutional reforms, right? That it can't just be to advantage one party over the other, because each of these questions in and of themselves is pretty complex.
If I could just add that, there's clearly a whole lot of institutional tinkering that's needed. I think one of the coinages of the coronavirus era is doom scrolling, when you're just trolling the internet looking for more bad news. And of course, you're never disappointed in that regard because there's plenty. Well, there's a whole literature out there on all kinds of oddities of the Electoral College system, whether it's, disloyal electors who decide to cast a vote for somebody other than the population in their state has voted for, the ability of state governments to interfere somehow with its work. So this is one area where there's clearly a kind of a major overhaul of the plumbing that's needed to bring it up from 18th, 19th century specs to something a little bit closer to the 21st century.
Well, let me jump in here, because I mentioned at the beginning that there are some things that still puzzle me about the United States after a couple of decades here. And one thing that puzzles me is the degree of extraordinary reverence that is given to the founders. And you see some reverence in my home country of Ireland as well, given to the people who founded it. But also there's perhaps because they were still around in living memory, or close to living memory, there's a certain degree of skepticism and of willingness to recognize that there were some decisions that they made which weren't necessarily the right ones. Whereas in the United States, there's this, so the way in which political argument is couched very often is in terms of, here is the founder's intent, here's what this constitution was supposed to do. And of course, it's a wonderful constitution, it's a wonderful document, but it's also, it's over 2 centuries old. So how, I guess, to put what you're both saying in a more provocative way, to what extent do we want to do what we want to do in terms of the constitution that exists and the founders' original intentions? To what extent do we want to try and get away from that? And I suspect that you both have different answers to that, but I would be really interested to hear what those answers are.
I can jump in here. So I will leave it to Eliot to talk about, because this is about more the sort of like reverence for the founders and things like that. But here's what I would say is that, to me, the genius of the constitutional democracy in the United States is, and actually Eliot and I were talking about this right before the conversation. We were talking about this offline before the public conversation began, is the flexibility of the system to adapt to changing needs over time, right? And so if we think of the first founding as being in the late 1700s, that often we talk about there having been a second founding in the United States and a second constitutional founding after the Civil War. And some people say there's a third constitutional founding with the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. And I think it's possible that we're in a moment right now where we're in need of a third or fourth founding, depending on how you might count it, where the structures that were originally created have morphed over time in interacting with the sort of realities of the political moment to no longer be appropriate in the ways that they were originally designed. And so we need a different founding. And so, but to me, the fact that we can have these repeated foundings within the context of this original framework that was created, like that's the genius of the system in a lot of ways. And I think that it can be true that there was these mechanisms that were created in the original constitutional convention to lay the foundation for democracy to be this living system that gets created, and to sort of say that there were mistakes made in the past that we can correct for in the future as the political realities of the moment change.
So Henry, as a good conservative in the true sense of the word, I don't believe in blowing up stuff that's worked for over 200 years. And actually, the fact that something has worked for a couple hundred years on the whole makes me want to preserve it. So there's my conservatism on display. I think that, look, there's a lot. The founders were a bunch of geniuses. They created a system that could adapt. They understood the kinds of challenges that we were going to face. First, starting with the issue of slavery, which they understood had the potential to blow the country wide open, and nearly did. They understood the challenges you were going to have in creating a vast country operating under a system of free government, which nobody had ever really been able to pull off before. They understood everything about that you needed to know about the nature of demagogues. I was mentioning to Hahrie earlier on my favorite story from the Constitutional Convention, which is that when Benjamin Franklin was leaving the convention, which had met in secret, he's asked by a crowd of people, "What kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" And he says, "A republic, if you can keep it." So the founders perfectly well understood the nature of the kinds of challenges that could come and buffet us. And it's a system which is flexible enough to be able to change. This, the party system was not envisioned, but look, it works. And what the system is built to do, and I'll quote another Anglophone immigrant, a friend of mine, David Kilcullen, who's an Australian, who's now an American citizen, who had served as an Australian officer actually in the Pentagon. I remember him describing to me how he was telling some of his Australian colleagues about how the US system of government functioned. He said, the thing that I finally figured out is it's designed not to function too well. And that's right. It is designed, so that ambition will counteract ambition. As I forget whether it was Hamilton or Madison who said that. It's designed to create certain protections in terms of, say, the Bill of Rights, an independent judiciary, which after all, not everybody has, bicameralism, and the whole thing. It is designed to block tyranny. And I think actually, the thing that's marvelous about the last 4 years, when I think we have been dealing with somebody who left to his own devices would choose that path, the system hasn't gone along with it.
So one of the big questions, as you say, is you talked about the question of slavery and how slavery could potentially have torn the United States apart back when it was the colonies trying to figure out how to do things. And of course, this is one of the big, the extraordinarily big enduring questions of the United States. So I recently read a book by Suzanne Mettler and our colleague at Hopkins, Rob Lieberman, which talks about democracy and talks about the various challenges of democracy and talks about the ways in which, in effect, their argument is that US democracy was in many ways erected on the back of disreputable bargains, which effectively practically disenfranchised large numbers of Americans because they were African Americans and because this was the compromise that people felt, the elite people felt needed to be made in order for the system to to actually hold together. Now, in a sense, over the last period, we've seen a furore in historical debate and also in people mobilizing on the streets around these historic injustices. And so I wonder what both of you have to say about the role that these injustices play in thinking about rebuilding American democracy. If we are to rebuild American democracy in order perhaps to unravel some of these bargains, what kinds of ways ought we do that?
So, you know, I haven't read the book in question, but as somebody who's thought about politics and actually been involved in it, my question is always, your alternative suggestion was what? Because, you know, political figures operate with the world that they have. And you could have blown the United States up from the very outset. Do we really think that would have been a better world? I don't think so. You could have had a secession crisis in the 1820s and 30s. Do we really think that would have turned out better than things eventually turned out at the cost of a great deal of bloodshed? I'm not so sure. The question really is always has to be, well, what is it that you can actually do? The fact is, slavery together with treatment of Native Americans, those are the two dark streaks across American history. Those are the wounds that are still there, the scars that are still there, and in some ways they're still weeping. I guess I think about it the way my old boss, Condi Rice, used to think about it. And I believe actually, I'm not sure whether we recorded her session at SAIS this summer here, which is not to deny any of this and not to deny the truth of any of this, but to say that what's marvelous about the American experiment is that the ideals that were put forward, including by slave owners like Thomas Jefferson, is the vision that offers us a way ahead and a way out of it. And by the way, it's not the case. It's not the case that the United States is racist and other societies are not. That we know that that's not true. But I think that's really the key to it. And you know, Condi was always, on the one hand, acutely conscious of, as she said, you know, having the blood of slaves in her veins. But there she is, the Secretary of State. And so that means that this country is capable of change and evolution. And I think to go down another path is to go down a nihilistic path where everything is just darkness and gloom and unfixable. And I really reject that.
So I guess I would, I believe that probably like the central challenge for us to grapple with in the coming decades is this question of whether or not we can build solidarity across race and build a truly democracy. And for me, part of that just comes if we just look demographically at the predictions, that America, as a country, is becoming increasingly more diverse. And the extent to which our political system is able to accommodate that or not, I think, is going to be the central challenge for the next generation or two. Now, in order, as we think about that and how we kind of square that with the past, I think it can both be true that the country has in the past done horrific things to all different kinds of people, and that past doesn't have to be prologue, right? That, there's this quote I know that Henry's heard me use a lot that I use all the time, that sort of where this Jewish theologian sort of says, hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. And to me, that in a lot of ways that's the audacious promise that's at the heart of democracy, right? Which is this notion that we know that humans aren't equipped for democracy inherently, but can we put them in settings and create a system where the possible becomes more plausible, because of the sort of institutional structures that incentivize certain kind of behaviors and outcomes that sort of check tyranny of power and all these different kind of things, but also because of the sort of civic settings where people are invited to reach towards their Madisonian better angels, so to speak. And I think that like one of the big challenges for us to figure out, which I don't think we have yet figured out in certainly in civil society and certainly in the political coalitions that we've built, is what it means to really create solidarity across race. And I think right now, and the challenge for that, I will say, by the way, is that I think is not different from a point that Eliot was making earlier in a different context, which is that there's a whole set of people, I think, both white working class voters and communities of color, that feel that they're being left behind by the system, right? And I think the fragility of our system comes from this question of what is the extent to which the mass public feels like democracy is a system that's ultimately going to be working for them, right? And if they feel that no matter what they do, there are no options and that there's no political home for them, then I think the whole system itself is threatened. And so to me, these questions about racial injustice and the questions of how we think about rural white voters or white working class voters that feel left behind are one and the same of what is the extent to which we can create a system that actually will meet the most basic needs of all people out there.
If I could just jump on that last point, because I think it's absolutely critical. You know, the one of the slogans of the Nazi Party during its rise was "Little man, what now?" And you know that, and what they were doing is they were capturing the despair of people who felt that the system could never work for them, that they were going to be crushed by these impersonal forces. And we're living in a period where there are these large impersonal forces out there. And I think it does require a kind of care and focus to make sure that that doesn't take hold. Because in that sense of despair, you open the way up to violence, you open the way up, or you open the way up to, you know, what in fact you do see in some pieces of American society, you know, was in effect a kind of suicidal slide into drug abuse and all kinds of things. And then the other thing I would just say is one of my heroes is Martin Luther King. He was an optimist and he believed in the United States. And the arguments that he made in his great speeches, which I wish people would read more than they do, is that he would hold the United States to account for its stated values, that's what he was doing. And that was what he was doing. And let's not forget, in large measure, it worked. We are not now where we were 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. The society has gotten much better in so many ways. And although there's still an enormous amount of work to be done, I mean, one of the things that disturbs me so much about the time we're in is how many people are just letting themselves give in to despair. And I just think it's wrong, and I think it's dangerous.
So we've got, we're running low on time. We've got two questions, which I am going to summarize very quickly, if you can respond to as you can. And then maybe we move into just summing up the conversation where it's been. One is from Aditya Banerjee, who wants to know more or less, if we're talking about these big reforms, how could these possibly work? Could we imagine a presidential candidate running on a platform of institutional reform? What kinds of reforms are possible? It's really hard to see how this can be done in a majoritarian system. And the other is from Alex Wright, who asks how academics and universities can compete with the mass media in getting a more a more reason-based discussion and evidence-based narrative out there. What kinds of options are there for the universities to compete in what is a crowded space of voices shouting?
I'll take, I guess, an initial crack. I would say, look, I think we're about to enter a period of very fluid politics in which you might not run on a platform, but you might find yourself doing certain things. I think Joe Biden is a pretty centrist kind of Democrat, but I wouldn't be surprised if he does non-centrist things in government, particularly if it's Democrats have control of both the House and the Senate. This is not a, Abraham Lincoln didn't run on an emancipation platform. So that's point one. I think to the other is the mass media are accessible to academics. They just need to be able to write well.
What are you saying, Eliot? I mean, obviously, so I can't really give justice to both of those questions in this short period of time that we have left. But let me kind of offer one idea that I think kind of ties some of these ideas, some of the last streams of conversation together. So as Eliot and Henry know, like one of the big research projects that I've been working on recently is with evangelical megachurches and trying to understand the way in which they relate to politics in a variety of different ways, because they're obviously an important force in American politics right now. And I was talking to one of the pastors of, these are like, 20,000 person and above kind of churches. And one of the points that he made that really stuck with me in the conversation is the idea that, he has always felt like church is a place where people should be able to be known, and that one of the challenges that he faces in thinking about the relationship of his 20,000 person church community and the political world out there is, how does he create a space where people from all different political persuasions feel like they can be known? And I thought that was a really interesting provocation, because as we think about things like, can you imagine system, reforms of the system as opposed to a focus on kind of certain policy outcomes that we want, or can you imagine how do we think about universities sort of competing with the sort of in the marketplace of ideas? Like, to me, this kind of gets back to sort of where we began, which is like, what is the relationship between the ideas and the policies that we promulgate and the practices and habits of democracy that people are able to cultivate? And do people have places where they feel like they are known in the political system? And if it always seems abstract and too far and too distant from people, then I do agree that the sort of willingness of people to to sort of enact kind of systemic institutional reform in the absence of sort of real policy changes that they want, it probably is pretty remote, right? But if we can sort of recreate the kind of place, the political homes where people feel like they are known in the same way that they might in other spaces in their community, then I think we have much more hope of being able to return things like reason to political life.
So I think we're at the stage where we should move to summations of the conversation.
I'm not going to sum anything up. I'll just say, first, I want to say thank you so much to both of you. This is, I really appreciated this conversation. And I'll just make one observation. Henry, you're an immigrant. Hahrie, you're the daughter of immigrants. I'm the grandson of immigrants. Think about that. Do you think that any of our grandparents, when they were aged 18, could have imagined the lives that their grandchildren would have been living now and the opportunities that we've all got? And I think, what makes me, like I said, a long-term optimist about this country.
Yeah, I would, I don't know that I have much more to add to that, except to say that, we at SNF Agora are so delighted to have the opportunity both to have this conversation, but to continue to build the institutional partnership with SAIS. And I think a lot of the questions that we put on the table today are some of the questions that we hope to be exploring together. So I really look forward to that opportunity.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been, I think, a wonderful and wide-ranging conversation. As promised, it's touched upon areas of strong agreement, and it's also touched upon the areas of real and continued and considered disagreement that have to be the engine going forward of how we start to confront all of these difficult issues. And because within disagreement, in a sense, is contained sort of the diversity that Hahrie talked about that is increasing in American society, and the ability to start to try and figure out what might be the appropriate solutions to the really, really pressing problems that all of us face as we try to think about how to rebuild American democracy. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Henry.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, Hahrie.